The Russian military continues to take significant losses as a result of the changes that take place in the battle between Ukraine and Russia daily. The Russian army is now in a difficult position due to the persistent fighting of the Ukrainian heroes. The Russian army, which has grown much less experienced as a result of the declaration of mobilization by the Russian administration, is not content with the loss that took place on the territory of Ukraine. In the Donetsk region, where Ukraine has begun to dominate the Russian army, which is concerned on all sides and is currently contented with only escaping from the Ukrainian bodyguards, the effects of the risky mobilization decision taken by Russian leader Vladimir Putin are strongly felt. The decision was made in the context of the Donetsk region, where Ukraine has begun to dominate the Russian army. The concept of the escape plan, formerly referred to by the Russian administration as a careful retreat, has now evolved into an essential part of the Russian army's operations. The Ukrainian heroes have taken advantage of the concentration of the Russian army in Luhansk by speeding up their operations in Donetsk. The Russian army is now held captive in this territory thanks to Zelensky's forces, who most recently entered the city of Lyman in Donetsk. Due to the geographical positioning of the Russian army, there is no way they could get assistance from another force, and they do not have an exit strategy either. Since the 1st of October 2022, the courageous men of the Ukrainian army have been stationed in the Donetsk area. Now we shall discuss the remarkable recent events that have taken place in this area. The Ukrainian army made incremental gains throughout the day, eventually reaching the city of Lyman in the Donetsk area. As was said before, the Ukrainian army succeeded in its goal to encircle the city of Lyman, which plays a vital role in transportation and supplies. The Ukrainian army was able to accomplish its goal. Because there are now more than 5,000 Russian forces in Lyman and the Russian soldiers are encircled by the Ukrainian army, this astounding revelation has impacted the international agenda. Because Ukraine is laying siege to the territory, the Russian forces stationed in Limon feel rather apprehensive. The Ukrainian attack, which might start at any time, has the potential to put a stop to the presence of Russian forces in this area. The Russian military personnel stationed in Limon know the situation and have communicated their desire to evacuate to Moscow. Initially, the Moscow administration and the Russian Defense Ministry refused to comply with the request to pull back the soldiers stationed in Lyman. However, the Russian forces stationed in Lyman are being progressively pulled out of the city since the Ukrainian army now has full command of all of the maritime routes in the area. The Ukrainian army delayed quite some time before finally taking control of this territory. The invading soldiers could withdraw from this region because they effectively fired at the brave army of Ukraine and shot against the Russian watchtower. The brave Russian soldiers kept their assault until the Russian army withdrew from Lyman. Lyman is not a city that can be ceded to the Russians without much of a fight. The Moscow army has established a frontline supply center in Lyman since it is an important town. The bridge led to the Russian administration's ambition of seizing the Donbass, while at present, Ukrainian flags are already flying in this area. Since September, the courageous Ukrainian troops have been working non-stop at Kupiansk and on the east bank of the Oskil River. Both locations are near one another. The successful conquest of Kharkiv by Zelensky's forces in September had two purposes. It improved the morale of the Ukrainian army and paved the way for further Ukrainian liberation operations. After making aggressive advances, Kupiansk and Kharkiv could free the city of Lyman, which the Ukrainian heroes had held. After Ukraine's successful siege of Lyman, which froze up the enemy's supply lines, the Ukrainian fighters now have a much stronger position in the Donbass area. The Russian government continues to undermine the effectiveness of the Russian armed forces. The Moscow administration demonstrated that it did not care for its troops stationed in the area by denying the request of more than 5,000 Russian soldiers in Lyman before the siege to evacuate from the city. If the Russian forces stationed in Lyman had not retreated and kept fighting, all of the members of the 5,000-strong Russian army would have been killed. As of right now, Russian troops are serving in the 5,000-strong Russian unit who were able to preserve their lives as the retreat from Limon continued. However, the Ukrainian army neutralized many Russian soldiers leaving the area. It is yet unknown how many Russian troops were hurt before they were forced to evacuate the area. The humiliating loss in Limon not only decimated the Russian army, but also brought shame to the Moscow administration and, most importantly, to Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia. Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, has not remarked yet, even though he is losing an increasing amount of credibility in international politics. The administration housed inside the Kremlin is also among those who have stayed mute about the tremendous loss to Lyman. The heroic leader of the Ukrainian forces, Zelensky, extended his congratulations to his men and promised that Ukraine would recapture all of its territories in a concise amount of time. Heroic Zelensky's army continues their march by continuing from the city of Lyman, barring any threats that may come from the north to the cities of Sloviansk and Krasnoyarsk, which are now under the hands of the Ukrainian military. People may get aggravated by the continual reporting on the demonstrations. Still, one must not lose sight of the hidden risk here. If an oppressive and violent government is allowed to persist for a significant amount of time in a country, that nation may one day face the possibility of an all-out public rebellion or the takeover of power by the army, both of which signal that the route to power has come to an end. On the other side, the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is striving to obscure the positive developments that have been made in the United Kingdom. In most cases, President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, who is always at the forefront of his country's activities, ignores the empty threats made by the Russian leader. If the Ukrainian heroes keep making the relentless progress they've been making, and there are some remarkable possibilities. If the current state of affairs persists, one of the arguments is that the length of the conflict might be reduced. The Ukrainian pirates have their origins in Russian command centers. The Ukrainian military is destroying the ranks of Russian troops. Due to the Ukrainian army's persistent strikes on Russian thrones in the south of Ukraine, Russian forces suffer tremendous casualties. Ukraine added additional territories where it saw Putin sign a decision to advance the rookie Russian man in reaction to the Ukrainian army. He miscalculated the frantic advance of the new troops joining the army after Putin's declaration of mobilization. Having inexperienced Russian soldiers at the front of the hoax will have catastrophic results. The Ukrainian army rolled up its sleeves to capitalize on Putin's miscalculation. Another illustration is that Russian troops who joined the military as a consequence of the Russian government's mobilization and lacked military training would participate in the throne. The Ukrainian army concentrated its assaults on the regions where the Russian leaders were stationed, and the attacks were conducted in line with their aims. The search for the Russian commander was successful. The top leader of the Russian forces in Ukraine was killed by Ukrainian army personnel. Due to the Ukrainian army's successful operations, the Russian army suffered another setback. It was revealed that a senior leader of the Russian forces was 41 years old when he was slain in the Ukrainian army's offensive near Bakhmut in the internal province. Mercenaries have taken a significant part in recent months in contra-operations against the Ukrainian army in Ukraine after Russian soldiers sustained severe casualties. Alexei was recently featured in The Best in Hell, a Russian documentary film about the Wagner ensemble. The Wagner team, often known as the Best of Health, failed against Ukraine. During the Kashmir War in Syria a few years ago, U.S. Special Operations and airports eliminated the Wagner organization in large numbers. In the Russian army, around 1,000 mercenaries, including members of the Wagner gang, are fighting against Ukraine. The Russian mercenary Wagner organization recruits murderers, robbers, and loaders from Russian jails to restore losses sustained during Ukrainian army strikes. Friday's vote is an attempt by Russian President Vladimir Putin to retain his presence in Ukraine. President Putin of Russia proclaimed the official takeover of 4 Ukrainian regions that had been mainly under Russian control since the invasion on February 24. Putin's declared and extradited territories are Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, none of which are entirely under Russian control. According to reports, locals in Luhansk and other regions didn't vote decisively to support joining Russia. Advocacy organizations see Putin's annexation declaration as a hoax. In response to the illegitimate annexations proclaimed by the Russian government, the United States placed fresh sanctions against Russia's military-industrial complex. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said, "We will not allow Putin to acquire a portion of Ukraine fraudulently." The prevalent view is that Luhansk, Purusha, and Kherson are not under Russian control, according to the Ukrainian government and the world's leaders. Therefore, the September 30th annexation decision of Russian leader Putin in 4 areas is illegitimate, void, and unacceptable as long as Putin's troops control the majority of the 4 regions. Given that Russian authorities forced the ballots in the unlawfully annexed territories, Russia's purported annexations occur in areas where they lack complete military control. Putin, the leader of Russia, is attempting to make and execute decisions independently. His behavior during the referendum was criticized in the West. After the vote, the Ukrainian government is clamping down on Russia's responses. The Ukrainian army attack recaptured regions north and northwest of Kherson on September 29, 2022, while the Ukrainian forces were able to reclaim some areas southeast of Luhansk. The Ukrainian army maintains a presence along the Oskil River in the newly regained and Russian-occupied Kharkiv district. The Ukrainian army patrolled the area with tanks during the Ukrainian warriors' assault. Melitopol and its environs comprise the majority of northern Prussia, where the capital of the same name is the focus of assaults. Continuous fighting has occurred between the Ukrainian army and Russian soldiers over western Donetsk towns, notably the important Ukrainian city of Lyman. Moscow has not yet provided a clear indication of how it would handle territories it does not control or that Ukrainian troops have recaptured. Kherson and Zaporizhia are likewise not under the jurisdiction of the Russian government, which has not announced what it intends to do with them. Covert strategies back Putin's annexation goal. According to Putin, the annexation territories would be seen to belong to Russia, and any threat or assault against these districts would be construed as having been directed at Russia. Putin has delivered a credible nuclear threat to the whole globe. Putin said he would subjugate all 4 areas under Russia's nuclear policy. This permits the Kremlin, in addition to reacting to a ballistic missile or nuclear strike on the country, to deploy nuclear weapons in the case of a threat to the country's territorial integrity. Ukrainian authorities characterize Putin's declaration as nuclear blackmail. The Ukrainian government requested that nuclear-powered nations speak out against Putin's threats. Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine, characterized these threats as foolish and utterly inadmissible and warned that Ukraine would not cave to European intimidation and would not capitulate. Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, said that all nuclear states should speak out and make it plain to Russia that such language endangers the global community and will not be accepted. Putin's primary motivation for threatening nuclear weapons was his crushing loss at the hands of the Ukrainian army, which he saw as weak. The Russian army's negligence resulted in significant losses of personnel and equipment. Since February 24, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has reportedly killed about 60,000 Russian troops and damaged over 10,000 tanks, armed personnel carriers, infantry combat vehicles, artillery pieces, and other military systems. Russia is losing the Russian-Ukrainian struggle in Ukraine. Since the commencement of their onslaught, the Russian army has been losing battle after battle for more than 7 months. The Russian military is recruiting in response to demands from the Russian military. For the Russian army, the scenario in the conflict is described as dark as it can get. The exhausted Russian army cannot advance. The Russian military is retreating. Victory is inevitable for the Ukrainians if the Ukrainian force can continue the continuity of its advance against a Russian army that is unduly fatigued.